Hi, everyone. Good morning. This is the 7th TGI FHI of the year. I'm sorry we can't host you in Smith Warehouse over breakfast, but I'm really happy that this way, in this format, we can have people from near and far. Those of you who aren't in our time zone, good afternoon, good evening, perhaps good night. Over the past 2 years, we've had Duke colleagues from humanities, arts, and interpretive social sciences fields present their scholarship. This year, in all likelihood, in Zoom format throughout, we have a total of 16 talks. So please do come back for more next semester. This is the final one of this semester, but we'll resume again in January. And there are talks that are on our website. The previous 6 talks on our website are available to you, along with suggested readings and also with an interview with our presenters. We've expanded things a little bit this year, so you have the chance to get to know our faculty a little bit better. I'm Ranji Khanna. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute. It's my great pleasure this morning to introduce Fadi Bardawil, who is an assistant professor of contemporary Arab cultures in the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. Professor Bardawil has published widely in areas of critical cultural anthropology, intellectual history, and comparative Arab thought, with sharp attention to how the term theory functions in relation to each of these. As such, his work participates in and indeed contributes to Duke's strength in what we call the theoretical humanities. The theoretical humanities constitutes a field that functions at the nexus of various forms of aesthetic criticism and theory, philosophy, anthropology, and cultural studies, and includes an investigation into disciplinary development and challenges the disciplines included in the humanities to ask different questions than their histories have previously allowed or thought relevant. The theoretical humanities examines cultural paradoxes, elements of change and continuity rather than certainty, recognizing the significant impact of cultural production and dynamic relation to the development of cultures, political spaces, and academic disciplines, and encourages the work of spirited writing, different kinds of theoretical writing that acknowledges the formative power of cultural production. In Fadi's work, these cultural products include philosophy, anthropological materials, archival materials. His recent book, congratulations, it just appeared a few weeks ago, Revolution and Disenchantment, Arab Marxism and the Binds of Emancipation, was published in Duke University Press's Theory in Form series, and functions in this broader field of humanistic theoretical work. It's a dense and brilliant book and is, on a fundamental level, an intellectual history of the Lebanese New Left in the 1960s, in the late 1960s. And it takes a deep dive into historical materials from that period to understand the production and circulation of revolutionary thinking in the Arab intellectual tradition. In doing so, Fadi also has to find a distinct critical method, given the extensive discussion in Lebanese art and thought on the question of archive, its absence, its destruction, its creative construction. He centers on Wahda Sharara and looks to the ways in which, in an ethnographic vein, we may understand the relationship of revolutionary theory to its life in the world. This form of theoretical fieldwork leads to some central questions around the revolutionary subject. How are intellectuals vectors of revolution? How is revolutionary theory activated in the world? Is political organization a mediator between theory and practice? And what are the problems of understanding such organization as a conduit of power? How do we understand affiliations beyond class? Who or what is the subject of revolution? And what is their relationship to the subject of history? In grounding the study in a sense of the vibrant, translational, and transfiguring world of an Arab intellectual tradition that is exemplified in a context in which Ibn Khaldun, Althusser, Fanon, Lacan, Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg, French Maoism vie for and are made equal actors in the new forms of Arab revolutionary possibility. He asks us to consider what constitutes disenchantment with this body of work also, and how one understands the relationship between the revolutionary subject of change, critique, and organizing on the one hand, and the historical subject of disenchantment on the other. Today, his talk will be probably about 45 minutes, I'm guessing, followed by questions which you should address to me in the chat. Thanks for coming, everyone. Fadi's talk today is titled Overcoming Theory's Resistances, Translating Arab Revolutions, Past and Present. I now invite him to speak and you all to listen.
Thank you very much, Ranji, for that generous introduction. Thank you, everyone, for attending and listening to the talk. I will share my screen and start promptly. At a fundamental level, my work is preoccupied with the question of theory and practice. More precisely, what I've been trying to do for the past years is explore the seductions, authority, deployments, and pragmatics of theory, both in revolutionary political organizations and academic settings. My modes of investigation are predominantly historical and ethnographic, in contrast, say, to a philosophical one that offers an a priori account of how theory ought to relate or not to practice. Having said that, I'm also interested in thinking about how to rewire some of our critical theories to account for the unexpected eruption of seismic events. This is why this talk is in two parts. The first part is on the politics of translation, and the second one is on the translation of politics. Looked at from the perspective of the Arab revolutions that began in 2011, we seem to be entering a post-postcolonial time, a term I borrow from Charlie Pio. These post-political times are beginning the process of a political decentering of the West in practice after it has been subjected to multiple iterations of theoretical decenterings in the past. Unlike most 20th century mass movements, the revolutions that mobilized millions of citizens against their own regimes were not propelled by anti-imperialist engines. This does not mean that anti-imperialist concerns were completely absent, but that they were not the main drive of the revolutions. Earlier political movements in the region carried successively the banner of decolonization from political domination, independence movements, political and economic dependence, radical national liberation movements and the left, and Western culture alienation, Islamist political movements. Moreover, the recent geopolitical conjuncture dislodged the post-Cold War arrangement during which the West, and particularly the US, was the supreme intervening military power. Arab and regional forces such as Israel, Turkey, and Iran, and non-Western international powers such as Russia and China are increasingly involved in the region. Two caveats. First, unlike its decentering in theory, which is staged as a liberatory act of decolonization, the West's decentering in practice did certainly not usher in a progressive era. A quick glance at the Russian, Iranian, Turkish, and Israeli involvements in Syria, in addition to Western ones, and the destruction they brought on are enough to put an end to the automatic association of the decentering of the West with the horizon of justice. Having said that, this is certainly not a cause for imperial nostalgia and to begin lamenting the decline of Western civilization. The multipolar interventions today are in part the consequences of the recent US interventions in the region. This decentering is a crucial fact to be reckoned with without celebration or lamentation. And it is not an easy thing to do, since clear-cut binary antagonisms and the logic of the main contradiction are hard to dislodge from political alignments and some critical contraptions. In excavating the forgotten archive of the 1960s Lebanese New Left, as well as in observing the multiple discourses aiming to represent the 2011 revolutions, I have often had to deal with and try to overcome a set of theoretical, disciplinary, and political resistances. In the first case, the one that deals with the 1960s New Left, they were for the most part resistances towards a charitable translation of the Arab Marxist tradition. In the second, the resistance was towards the translation of the practices of the men and women who have risen against their regimes into the domain of emancipatory politics, if not their whole foreclosure of the whole foreclosure of their practice from the domain of the political. These theoretical resistances to translation uncover a metropolitan unconscious at work, which keeps the West at its heart, either to load it or to criticize it. Critical strategies that rely exclusively on speaking back to the West through marshalling a set of binaries, such as homogenization difference, universal particular, secular non-secular, westernized elite, non-westernized masses, liberal Muslim, non-liberal Muslim, retain at the heart of their deepest attachments the West. These strategies cannot account for political practice outside of its relation and opposition to imperial orbits, which contributes to obliterating the revolutionaries' attempts to make their own history, reinscribing again and again the West as the main subject and agent of history. My claim in what follows is simple. In this new conjuncture, the labors of translation are needed more than ever to invent new figures of the thinkable. The first step in this process is to think through the resistances to translation, which is a question both of epistemological reflexivity and a politically urgent one, since translation is at the heart of rethinking a politics of solidarity. How to be in solidarity across difference in an unequal world? I ask, leaning on Anat Singh's work, without either domesticating difference or paternalism. I will now read part of an exchange I had with Waddah Sharara on the translation of Bourdieu in the mid-60s, Beirut, to give you a sense of the kind of work I've done in fieldwork and theory. Some of the things that gave this thing by which the speaker, Sharara, means their Marxist militancy clearer features were minor mobilizations that took place in the teachers, students, and television sectors. Actually, they were not always that minor. At least in the student sector, they weren't. We had a comrade, a friend whose name is Christian Ghazi. I'm not sure if you know him. No, I said. He was at the time a technician in the TV station at Hazmi, Channel 7. A few things were tested. The student sector witnessed demonstrations, and I wrote an article using Bourdieu. Positively, I said. Yes, at that time, the secondary school demonstrations demanded the elimination of the disqualifying grade in foreign language examinations, which contributes to the system's reproduction, I sort of added hastily. So Bourdieu, provided an analysis on a silver platter of why this demand is important and why it is initiated from Sur, Beirut, from the western part, cities with a Muslim majority residents. The sieve, I said, probably having in mind Bourdieu's analysis of how the school system separates the inheritors from those students whose family origins did not equip them with a cultural capital, which enabled them to navigate smoothly the requirements of the school's curriculum. The democracy of teaching, parallel teaching and evening classes were all put on the table then, Sharara said, which was not that difficult because we had access to some figures. This was a time when Shihab initiated a project of choosing state employees who didn't have a baccalaureate but have some vocational training. This was a wide working site. This thing was also translated into political pamphlets in a very different language than the one used in the analysis. Did you formulate both the analysis and the pamphlets? Yes, I formulated the analysis and the pamphlets. Will I be able to find them? I asked. When we had this conversation, Sharara had just turned 65 in the summer of 2007. He had retired from the Faculty of Social Sciences at the Lebanese University after teaching at the country's public institution for about 30 years. He was in 2007 editor of Sahafat al-Alam, the world's press, a weekly supplement published by Al-Hayat, a Saudi-owned and widely distributed Arab daily, which selects and translates a wide swath of articles. First and foremost, Sharara is a prolific thinker whose works range is neither bound by discipline, geographical area, and time period. Multiple works on Lebanese history and sociology sit side by side with commentaries on texts from the Islamic Turath, meditations on Alexander Solzhenitsyn's writings, and translations of the French poet René Char. His recollections take us to a time when he was the intellectual powerhouse of Lubnan Ishtiraki Socialist Lebanon, an underground Marxist organization which was founded in 1964 by a handful of militant intellectuals in their 20s, a number of whom having previously dabbled with Arab nationalism, either in the guise of the Ba'ath or the Arab nationalist movement. Sharara participated in the founding of Socialist Lebanon after joining the French Communist Party and collaborating with the Réseau Francis Janson, a network of support for the Algerian struggle of independence, while studying in Lyon, France in the early 1960s. Later that summer, I met Ahmad Baidoun, the distinguished historiographer, who recalled in his characteristic, deep, emphatic tone, saying, "Things like that, the discoveries one made," he said in reference to Bourdieu and Passeron, but also to authors such as Althusser, Fanon, Foucault, Lacan, Castoriadis, Gars, who were read alongside the Marxist militant authors such as Lenin, Mao, Trotsky, Guevara, Luxembourg, Ziab, Castro. One combined these things, he said, to the extent that they were helpful in understanding the problem one was writing about. Socialist Lebanon was a hub of what Christine Bucki-Glucksmann called the transversality of knowledges that characterized the 60s. A transversality, not interdisciplinarity, a transversality which defied the logic of professionalization, expertise, and disciplinarity. Baidoun, the historian, kept most of Socialist Lebanon's archive and, in a very generous gesture, granted me full access. I dived into it a few months later in New York, reading the 5th issue of Socialist Lebanon's Bulletin, published in April 1967. I stumbled on an article titled "The Upcoming Battle of Secondary School Students," which argued how Lebanese schools are necessary institutions for the reproduction of social inequality in the country. Eliminating students because of their low grades in foreign language exams, argued the article, was the sieve the ruling classes used, and here I'm quoting, to bar the barbarian invasions of the children of the petite bourgeoisie, as well as some of the workers and peasant classes, end of quote, limiting them from reaching the echelons of the state's administration. Bourdieu was not mentioned in the text, nor was the text signed. The only names that would appear in the bulletin of Socialist Lebanon were those of authors who were strictly part of the revolutionary tradition, Marx, Lenin, Mao. This double erasure of authorship was related to legal, political, and theoretical issues. Some of the members were public school teachers at the time, which made it legally difficult to write under their own names while calling for a revolution against their employer. It also served them well politically, because the veteran and much larger Lebanese Communist Party, founded in 1924, and the other parties they were subjecting to a ruthless critique on the pages of their bulletin, could not assess the size of the new organization. The erasure of Bourdieu and the other sort of theoretical names, on the other hand, was an integral part of the means of production of revolutionary authority. During one of our conversations, Sharara mentioned that his militant voice was partially a consequence of not wanting to be taken for a farfelu, he said in French, which means eccentric, wacky, intellectual, tinkering with culture. In contrast, what he sought to was to basically have a revolutionary, to have a militant voice that is taken to basically ground political practice in Marxian theoretical analysis. There's also another reason, which is that they also subscribed to a collectivist ethos which permeated leftist political and artistic practices at the time. The Dziga group, a cinematographic collective which included Jean-Luc Godard, Jean-Henri Roger, and Jean-Pierre Gorin, for instance, was founded around the time of the student demonstrations and worker strikes of May and June in 1968 in France, 4 years after the establishment of socialist Lebanon. At the heart of these collective endeavors was an attempt to transform the relations of production, to re-articulate intellectual and political practice away from the bourgeois notion of the individual author, the tortured romantic genius, and the fetish of the name of the master. In addition to reworking the relations of production, these collectives strove to circulate their work outside of the market by bringing them to the people in non-commercial venues, such as factories, public spaces, and universities, to circumscribe turning them into a commodity with an exchange value that will eventually overcome its use value. While Socialist Lebanon initially included prices on their underground bulletin, the organization ended up distributing it for free. The bulletin was the main public face of the organization and its main tool of recruitment. It was delivered by hand by the members or partisans who made sure the contact was secure before they started handing it to him or her as a pretext for lengthy discussions supposed to prepare them to join a circle of partisans. The distinctions between the concreteness and messiness of field research in anthropology and the abstractness and slickness of theory, as well as the one between the bottom-up ethnographic theorizing and the top-down application of continental theory, do not hold when one's raw material and fieldwork experiences include translations of, glosses on, and engagements with works and authors that form the canons of political and social theory. In this case, the conceptual distance separating the tradition doing the inquiring and the one inquired about diminishes, for this is an internal traffic in theory. Yet, the initial conservative pleasure of recognition, which overcomes the anthropologist as a result of his or her acquaintance with these theorists in the classroom, quickly recedes from view. It vanishes as the researcher encounters the multiple social and political lives of concepts, which are translated, transfigured, and embedded in emancipatory projects by members belonging to a different generation. A generation whose spaces of experiences and horizons of expectation were fashioned by different times and places. This is why doing fieldwork in theory and tackling the question of theory from the South cannot restrict itself to picking a few concepts or authors away from their spaces of argument, to call into question some aspect of or highlight an absence in metropolitan critical theory. Fieldwork in theory moves away from the reification of discursive assumptions towards the labors of excavation of traditions of intellectual inquiry and the reconstitution of the theoretical, ideological, and political stakes at play in order to understand the numerous translations and modulations of critical theory. If we go back for a minute to Bourdieu and Passeron's texts, The Inheritors, that Sharara and Socialist Lebanon were working with and putting to use in 1967 in Beirut, we realize that it ended up being translated into English in 1979, 15 years after its original date of publication. By 1989, the anthropologist Laila Abou-Loughod notes that Pierre Bourdieu made his mark on North American anthropology and contributed alongside Clifford Geertz in rescuing Middle East and North African anthropology from its parochialism and theoretical poverty. In anthropology, theoretical contributions are valued for providing an abstract lingua franca that circulates between and brings together the speakers of different regional dialects to address disciplinary problems. Not speaking it risks consigning your work to invisibility and a limited reach, as Abu Luhud mentioned, to the fate of an autochthonous parochial intellectual. For more than a decade now, Susan Buck-Morss has been engaging Islamist political discourse. Her intervention is a courageous and generous one in the wake of the hostile political climate towards Muslims in the West in the post-September 11 world. Without seeking to defend all positions or movements under the Islamist banner, she urges us, her readers, to consider that Islamism, and here I'm quoting her, enables political discourses that are modern in their own terms rather than as failed mimicry of the West. End of quote. Buck-Morss constitutes her project of engagement with particular Islamic thinkers and their translation into the space of critical theory as a challenge to rediscover one's own commitments in a foreign political language, and to ask not only what is lost in translation, but also what might be gained. Buck-Morss's project of translation and rescue of the critical kernels of Islamist thinkers contrasts the new global left, which she hopes will come about, with the older Marxist one, which she depicts with broad brushstrokes. A comparison, she writes, informs us as to how the discourse of the new global left will be different from the Marxist international one, where translation occurred but heavily in one direction. Any leftist, she continues, who lived in or visited the undeveloped world at that time will be aware of the degree to which the Marxist left understood itself as an avant-garde in elite terms rather than popular and democratic. Despite their radically critical stance, Marxists embraced a vision of modernization that had in common with capitalism and imperialism a conception of the third world as inexorably backward and behind. End of quote. In Can There Be a Global Left, the last essay of the book, Buck-Morss reiterates her critique of the Arab Marxist tradition as caught in the webs of modernization theory. When Western critical discourse was adopted by Arabs in the Marxist mode, this absence of a double critique, Buck-Morss writes, tended to be just as prevalent as Arab Marxists were similarly adamant that their own societal and religious forms were vestiges of the feudal past. Why does Buck-Morss's admirable enterprise of translating Islamist thinkers to Western audiences in the wake of the War on Terror has to be coupled by a rough and ready ahistorical critique of the Arab Marxist thinkers and militants? Does her sketch of Sayyid Qutb as the eminent critic of Egyptian society necessitate painting his Arab Marxist contemporaries as adamant modernizers ensnared by Western concepts? Doesn't her sketch of Arab Marxists risk paralleling and giving conceptual fodder to nativist arguments attacking them for being vectors of a foreign important thought? In brief, failed mimics of the West. Arab Marxists were either criticized or neglected by critics whose reading practices condemned them for what they dubbed its Orientalist, historicist, and modernist discursive assumptions. Their epistemological complicity with empire, so to speak, turned them overnight from revolutionaries to discursive compradors. You know you're really out of luck when both Eurocentric Marxists and their post-colonial critics both agree to either ignore you or criticize you. Moreover, the imbrication of scholarship on the Middle East and Western political agendas sidelined militants who were neither bound by the frontiers of nation-states nor the boundaries of a religious tradition. Last but not least, these militant intellectuals who shared many of the same texts that came to constitute later on the body of theory we draw on appeared at first sight to be much closer to our discipline's theoretical skin than, say, Salafi Muslims. their low coefficient of otherness pushes to the limit the question of who occupies the slot of anthropological translation and is the subject of charitable interpretation, and who is the object of epistemological condemnation. This is why, in recovering this history, I worked against the tendency to treat modern and contemporary Arab intellectuals as falling into one of two camps, either imitators of the West, call themselves Orientalizing and Westernized natives if you want, or autochthonous religious thinkers. What I engage in is also far from a study of unilinear reception by Arab thinkers of Western revolutionary and critical theorists, which at times announces itself with sensationalist titles such as reading Althusser in Beirut, anticipating the dazzlement at the wonderful conjunction of reading a universal text, so to speak, Althusser, in a particular location, so to speak, Beirut. Reception presumes an a priori, an origin and a destination, an authentic and a copy, while I'm making a case for the primacy of multi-directional streams of translation. Let's go back to the archive of socialist Lebanon for a minute. It's difficult to conceive the lives of this generation of leftist militant intellectuals without dwelling on their own intimate relation to the practice of translation. During the days of militancy, one translated for purposes of political education as a strategy to give Marxist political arguments a different gloss on a doctrinal point and to anchor a political line in a theoretical ground. Later on, one did it to make a text available for students in a seminar, and of course, it's always one way to earn some income. These translations, especially those associated with the Marxist tradition, were not translated from their original languages, say German, Russian, Italian, but mostly from their French or English translations. At times, an Arabic text was produced by simultaneously translating from English and French translations. Such was the case with Gramsci. In the particular case of a translation from a translation, the Metropole's languages and publishing houses such as Les Éditions Maspero in Paris, L'État Moderne, and New Left Review in England were pivotal institutional bridges that made, via their languages, the ideas and experiences of different militants and theorists from the South and North accessible to each other. But besides their labors of linguistic translation, these militant intellectuals effected an additional act of translation. The knowledges they produced, relying on the transnational discourses of radical thought, were not merely representations of their societies, but interventions in them. They underscored the centrality of adapting Marxist concepts for the formulation of a communist politics which is attentive to the particularities of their political present. They were acts of transfiguration that refunction a text for different demanding sites, as Elizabeth Povinelli and Dilip Gawankar argue, moving away from translation's problematic of meaning and its attendant questions. For instance, in the introduction to Reading the Communist Manifesto, Socialist Lebanon states, and I quote, "What is the characteristic of our present era? Is a question that every communist has to ask. If the analysis of the particular characteristics of the present are foregone, then the party will be transported into splintered sectors, each working on its own without any relation to the others, but attending central committee meetings and discussing the general line that does not generalize anything but a bunch of slogans that should work in Bolivia and Sudan, as well as in Lebanon, which means that they are not valid in any country." By not taking into consideration the spatio-temporal characteristics of Bolivia, Sudan, and Lebanon, one traffics in hollow universals that have no traction. They are too general to be of any use. The emphasis on the present forecloses for Socialist Lebanon the possibility of a general and repeatable answer, which cuts across times and spaces. In doing so, the Lebanese militant group argued against viewing Marxism as a direct application of a body of theory to a particular situation. Situations that are themselves not generative of theoretical elaborations, but passive recipients of a revealed universal discourse. In a nutshell, failure to translate was to transform Marx's oeuvre to a lettre morte, a dead letter. There is no way then of being a proper communist without engaging in a translation of Marx and Engels' works, one which does not constitute an inauthentic copy of the original, a particular distortion of the universal text, or a failed mimicry of the West. On the contrary, translations are generative and constitutive, not only of Lebanese Marxism, but of the communist tradition of thought and practice. Innovative socialist revolutions, writes Socialist Lebanon, have been tied to novel theoretical thought. The Bolshevik Revolution and Lenin, the Chinese Revolution and Mao Zedong, the Vietnamese Revolution and Giap, the Cuban Revolution and Guevara. End of quote. In their interpretation, Marx's oeuvre constitutes the foundational text of the tradition which authorizes socialist political practice and thought. It does not, however, stand as the untroubled transhistorical universal to the particular glosses that come in its wake. Rather, Marxism cannot be separated from the circulation and translation to Marx's oeuvre itself. The universality of Marxism is constituted through and is a product of the multiple acts of translations, and does not precede them. These acts of linguistic translations from translations and conceptual transfigurations were fueled more by the impediment of revolutionary practice than a fidelity to an original text. They were not mediations between a self and another, an attempt to bridge supposed incommensurabilities between cultures, or an initiation of a dialogue between different intellectual traditions. Theirs was not an attempt that sought, as many critical and anthropological works do, to render what seems unfamiliar, at a first glance familiar, or going in the opposite direction, to denaturalize what we take for granted. They did not aim, like Susan Buck-Morss's reading of Islamist thinkers, towards a rediscovery of one's own commitments in a different theoretical language, or to reveal the contingency of one's own norms when refracted through a different prism. These practices, discourses, and institutions assumed and produced a global interconnectedness, a political universality of sorts, one that is premised on internationalist solidarity, the urgency of political practice, and multi-directional translation, north-south, south-south, which dodged the usual trap of recognition and consecration of authors from the colonies by the strong institutions of the Metropole. A while ago, Talal Asad argued that the structures of power the colonized writer confronts are institutional, not textual. He wrote, when someone pleads with the colonizer to make a judgment in a particular writer's favor, to have him or her translated and read seriously, what is taught, Asad added, is the modern world's culture's transcendent power to redefine the writer's value as universal. End of quote. In the case Asad is describing, the Metropole's institutions are the gatekeepers that grant access to an author to the universal, enabling the global circulation and multiple translations of the work, even though it is often a universal which always falls short of attaining true universality. Literary criticism in the Anglo-American Academy, Rosalind Morris notes, and here I'm citing her, tends to attribute to the third world literary text an irreducible particularity. The resistance here, she writes, is not of or by the third world writer and or her writings, let alone by the subaltern. It is the resistance of dominance to its possible displacement from the exclusive claim to universality. End of quote. In highlighting these points, what I'm after is to underscore three different pathways to think about universality. The first is the a posteriori outcome of political articulation. It is sustained by an ethos of internationalist solidarity that through traveling theories and traveling militants and multiple acts of translation and transfiguration fashions a common world. True, Historically, this pathway was premised on positing class as the universal glamour of inequality, to quote Sudipta Kaviraj. But its universality was also socially mediated and needed to be activated through practices of transfiguration and militancy. It was not automatic. The second pathway privileges contextless, supposedly a priori universal concepts, say rights, reason, freedom, which subsume automatically and are in no need of the double movement of transfiguration and militancy. The third is metropolitan institutional consecration, which I discussed in reference to Assad, which is an outcome of power. The world we inhabit today seems light years away from the one that the left inhabited in the 60s, which conceived of the world revolution, as Enzo Traverso noted, as a process unfolding in three distinct but dialectically correlated geographical spheres: anti-capitalist in the first world, anti-bureaucratic in the world of really existing socialism, and anti-imperialist in the third world. Today, the borders between certain quarters of the left and the right are getting harder to discern. The Arab revolutions put on the table again the thorny political and theoretical question of naming an event. These practices of emancipation, particularly the Syrian one, have been hastily brushed off in certain Arab and metropolitan leftist circles as not properly revolutionary. I mentioned the Syrian revolution because unlike the initial celebrations after toppling the pro-Western Tunisian and Egyptian presidents, the uprisings in Syria were met from the get-go by suspicious apprehension or direct support of the regime by certain quarters of the left. The practices of the revolutionaries who early on faced a ruthless war machine, which was not a client of Western powers, clashed with ideological first principles, primarily anti-imperialism, but also secularism, that supposedly guide these leftists' political alignments. Solidarity with these men and women was withdrawn, and first principles prevailed over practice. Moreover, this dismissal seems to have been vindicated by the tragic unfolding of events. The political defeats of the revolutions appear to confirm the truth of the judgment that is part of a distinguished genealogy of the collapse of conceptual truth onto political victory on the left. Little has eviscerated Marxism, Russell Jacoby wrote a long time ago, more than its acceptance of the judgment of history as truth itself. Victory, he reminds us, is not proof of truth, and vice versa. Moving beyond an assessment of the first principles that guide the left's political alignments, can our critical theories apprehend the event? In what way is the theoretical apprehension of the event, its naming, overdetermined by belatedness, i.e. its coming after revolutions from which the conceptual features of what defines a revolution is distilled? Seasoned scholars of Arab political life who tried their hands at giving a critical account of the revolutions outside of Eurocentric and stated molds drew their analytical tools from a leftist theoretical toolkit which is critical of neoliberalism. Asif Bayat, for instance, compared the Arab revolutions to the third worldist revolutions of the 1960s and the 1970s. He concluded that today's militants were co-opted by neoliberal logics and therefore lacked the radical anti-imperialist and social justice visions of emancipations that animated earlier revolutionary movements. The revolutionaries themselves, it seemed, were not proper revolutionaries. By the time the Arab uprisings occurred, he writes, and I'm citing him here, most Islamists and secular counterparts alike had been conditioned by the neoliberal climate. End of quote. I have a few qualms with this account. First, it bears a family resemblance with the deficit pronouncements that account for the present predicament of Arab societies by underscoring the deficits in, say, democracy, human rights, women's rights, you name it, that separate them from a Western liberal democratic norm. In this case, the interpretation of the revolution is overdetermined by their belatedness vis-à-vis the third worldist revolutionary moment. This comparative exercise overlooks the historical unfolding of the past century's revolutions that witnessed the transformations of anti-imperialist politics, whether secular or Islamists, and socialist ideologists, from visions of emancipation to bludgeons of power in the hands of regime and some militant forces. To point this out is not an argument for foregoing past and present anti-imperialist and socialist traditions in the Arab world. Rather, it is a reminder that the political conjunctures in which the revolutions unfolded is not one that can be subsumed under a smooth global narrative of transition from the good past of radical socialism onto the bad neoliberal present. Our pasts are connected in more than one way to our present. Moreover, Bayatz's account is articulated in a behavioralist idiom, which makes neoliberalism an overbearing climate, which conditions militants of various ideological shades. What troubles me the most is the attempt to critically apprehend the multiple interconnections of our present at the level of the circulation of capital and the productivity of political rationalities in a totalizing behavioralist theoretical dialect, one which is marshaled to banish the militants from the domain of revolutionary politics. The will to totality this account performs is very hard to square with the multiple political discourses, organizational forms, and collective initiatives in the Arab world. There's a particular ease with which the totalizing critical scholar delimits from his Olympian perch the parameters of the political game structured in advance by the transcendental force. In that case, it's neoliberalism. The revolutions also breached the matrix of left politics and critical theory that could not overcome the empire resistance binary. To say this is to point out that critical theories do not only fall short of apprehending events by active conceptual erasure and totalizing sweeps. At times, critical theory falls short because the event falls out of its circumscribed terrains of operations and remains invisible as a result. For instance, the Metropolitan oppositional epistemology critique, which caught like wildfire in the wake of Edward Said's Orientalism in 1978, did not develop critical conceptual tools to grasp the modalities of power at work in Arab and Muslim societies, whose subject was not the West. Its theoretical anti-interventionism, so to speak, performs well as long as its targets are discourses with universal aspirations, say human rights, or culturalist reifications about Islam and the Arab mind. Major crises in the region that did not revolve in the orbit of the West, politically and culturally, such as the internecine waves of battles during the Lebanese civil and regional wars from 1975 to 1990, the Syrian regime's massacre in Hama in 1982, and the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s remained invisible in theory. This issue is not exclusive to anti-imperialist practices of epistemological critique. The critical bite of more than a few of our critical theories is circumscribed by the implicit delimitation of their own terrain of operations. Deconstructionism, for example, Rosalind Morris notes, was mostly dominant in those spaces of the literary critical establishment where the textual objects of readings could be recognized as cultural artifacts of the same philosophical system to which it turned its critical eye. End of quote. The Frankfurt School of Critical Theory produced incisive and sweeping analysis of late capitalism, yet it never surrendered the West as its civilizational unit of analysis, Herbert Marcuse's allusions to anti-colonial struggle notwithstanding. The foreclosure of practices of emancipation in theory and the refusal to be in political solidarity with revolutionaries bring about questions that earlier generations struggled with. As I try to make sense of our present moment, I have been finding it increasingly helpful to revisit works of thinkers like Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, Hannah Arendt, and Edward Said, who resisted the great seduction of theory's powers of conceptual subsumption by remaining close to the pulse of those who were struggling against domination and exploitation. Through inventing new forms, through translations, displacements, and the stretching of traditions, in situations where the supposed mediations between theory and practice is severed. I will end my talk by a few illustrations of these practices of translations, displacements, and stretching of traditions. A few years after the beginning of the Algerian Revolution, in 1954, before the height of the Third World solidarity in which Socialist Lebanon was founded, Aimé Césaire, who was a deputy for Martinique at the time, wrote a powerful letter of resignation from the French Communist Party, addressed to Maurice Thorez, its Secretary General. Let's listen to Césaire as he justifies why he quit the party. Césaire, who is tackling the question of the relationship of the colonial question to communist internationalism, begins by underlining the former's singularity, which cannot be reduced to any other problem. The singularity is what preempts considering the colonial struggle a fragment of a more important whole, which is constituted by the struggle of the French worker against capitalism. He draws our attention to how taking class struggle as the universal ground of critique and solidarity robbed the colonial question of its singularity, rendering it subordinate to it and contributing to rejecting, and here I cite Césaire again, a priori and in the name of an exclusive ideology, men who are nevertheless honest and fundamentally anti-colonialist. End of quote. He goes on to point out that despite their radical class politics, metropolitan communists, like their bourgeois compatriots, espouse a simplistic, I quote again, omnilateral superiority of the West. End of quote. Both communists and colonialists share an attitude of paternalism, one which Syrian revolutionaries have recently complained of in their dealings with practices of European solidarity with their cause. Césaire ends his resignation letter by urging his readers to have the strength to invent instead of follow, and to clear the path of ready-made forms, those petrified forms that obstructed. As I read him, Césaire is certainly not arguing for foregoing alliances and solidarity. Rather, he is proposing that critical practice should be attuned to the world by inventing new forms which enable solidarities. If Césaire helps us to think the question of erasure of emancipatory struggle, Fanon, writing some 5 years after him in 1961, urges us to consider how the travels of revolutionary theory can flip its valence and recode its meaning. In The Wretched of the Earth, he tackles the question of mediation between theory and practice. For Fanon, nationalist parties and their base of urban voters benefit from the colonial system, and a large number of colonial subjects adhere to metropolitan political parties. These colonial subjects, he writes, are militant activists under the abstract slogan, power to the proletariat, he writes, forgetting that in their part of the world, slogans of national liberation should come first. The colonized intellectual has invested his aggression in his barely veiled wish to be assimilated to the colonizer's world, end of quote. Fanon's critical observation alerts us to the reifications of revolutionary theory, which is assumed to retain its critical bite regardless of where and when and by whom it's deployed. Marxist analysis, Fanon suggests, should always be slightly stretched when it comes to addressing the colonial issue. In opposition to the colonized militants dabbling in abstract slogans of power to the proletariat, Fanon elevates the wretched of the earth who are not assimilated to the colonial world and whose bodies bear its brunt to the role of the primary revolutionary agent. The wretched of the earth, as Dipesh Chakrabarty had noted a while ago, were like mouse peasants and Gramsci's subalterns, part of the search for a revolutionary subject that was not the proletariat, in the absence of a large working class, which was itself an exercise in a series of displacements of the original terms. Inventing new forms, stretching traditions, conceptual displacements could all be part of the toolkit of rewiring critical theory in response to emancipatory emergences that trouble its already existing articulations of theory and practice, and its resistances to the eruption of emancipatory events. I close by citing Césaire one more time. What I want, Césaire wrote, is that Marxism and communism be placed in the service of Black peoples and not Black peoples in the service of Marxism and communism. That the doctrine and the movement would be made to fit men, not men to fit the doctrine and the movement. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Fadi. You can, if you like, take off the screen share now, unless you think that you're going to be able to, you're going to want to use it again in the question answer session, Fadi. So you can stop the.
No, I'm good without it.
Okay, good. Just as a reminder to everyone, you can send in your questions to me through the chat, and then I can then translate them, transfigure them maybe to Fadi here. I'm actually just going to just while you're thinking of the questions, let me just sort of put one out there for you. I'm interested in, some of the terms that we might sort of think of in relation to universalism, right? This kind of or universality. Let me be more careful. You talked about universality rather than universalism. A universality that does not precede the act of translation, right? A different form of universality that isn't dependent on an idea of original and copy, as it were. And I'm interested, given that in the book there is this in a transversal way, let's say, this melding of the revolutionary consciousness and the theoretical consciousness. I'm interested in understanding what that term universality might have to do with one of internationalism, right? So in the arena of a revolutionary consciousness, a revolutionary language, is there a way in which we might think of this transfigured universality as a different internationalism? And maybe that's where you're going with that final moment of quoting Dipesh Chakrabarty and I mean, the term that Fanon would use is lumpen proletariat, of course, right? I mean, he's sort of garners that energy. It's rather like the subaltern, if you like. So I'm interested in where internationalism or maybe internationalist solidarity may sit in relation to your new transfigured universality. And also, I suppose, where humanism fits in relation to that as well. I mean, just I think the internationalism one is the one I really want to get to first, though.
Right. Thank you. This is a very, it's a fascinating question. In thinking about these questions, I was trying to, you sort of brought together two strands of the thought that I've been working with. One is I've been trying to sort of move away from, as I tried to sort of articulate two positions. One is a position that basically seeks to say that Marxism's universality is only inherent in its discourses by basically positing that class is the universal grammar of inequality, and therefore it's automatically a universal. And I wanted to sort of show how these labors of translations and transfigurations, in a way, are producing a universal through political articulation, not through conceptual subsumption. So this is one way I was thinking about it, which is why that tradition is very, very interesting for me. Now, of course, the critique of that, which I take, is that at the end of the day, what enabled these labors of translation and transfiguration for these generations of thinkers is that they believed in a history with a big H. Even if they're not historicists or they're not teleological, but what brought them together, so to speak, is the fact that they inhabited that ground, which then was splintered. So you sort of point to something that I do not relate, but what I wanted to think about is a weak notion of universality, so to speak, that comes out of practice that would lead to an internationalism which was not necessarily mediated by nation states, which is how the old way of thinking about internationalism, as thinking about Bandung, for example, and the faces of Nehru, Tito, Nasser, and the nation states. But to sort of bring your question back to the present, I mean, at the end of the day, my sort of what I care about is the question that Anat Singh asked, which is basically how can we be together while retaining our differences and not having a paternalistic attitude towards difference. So my thinking about this notions of political articulations are really less sort of motivated by trying to formulate a better theory of universality, but trying to basically see if there's, which is why I go back to Depeche at the end and then sort of different displacements, to see whether there's a form of internationalism in a way that can bring people together through political articulation without necessarily erasing difference. So the initial attraction to the Marxist tradition for me is that it's a tradition, unlike liberalism, that says that the validity of concepts itself is historically mediated. It does not exist a priori. And so the labors of translation, the labor of militancy itself is what brings something together. And I hope I managed to sort of like bring both of, I think you're pushing me to think about precisely, in a way, the thing that I'm really trying to think about in different ways, which is how is it that these articulations of universality, the thinking about universality as the result of political articulation and not subsumption would lead to a different kind of universalism. So, I mean, these are sketchy sort of preliminary answers, but thank you so much for that, Ranji.
Thank you. Thanks. We have a question that actually came in before the talk, but I think it's still relevant. Okay. From Militun Jurasco. In the October 17th Lebanese uprising, whenever the demands of the protesters come from a leftist point of view against capitalist and neoliberal policies, they are directly associated with communism and other leftist parties with a bad reputation during the civil war of the 70s and therefore rejected. How can we move over the fear of a leftist discourse that is always linked to communism and reminiscent to the Cold War and Civil War in Lebanon, and therefore often rejected? How can we construct a political alternative and frame around leftist progressive demands and make people overcome their fear linked to the Civil War and align with it? So now, I mean, something that I would just add to bring it into the context of the talk a little bit more, if you like, is because in some ways, you're exactly dealing with this question in the talk you've just given. But what the question addresses is fear, right? I mean, that there's an affective relationship here to the discourse, and to some extent, disenchantment is also working on an affective plane, right? So I'm wondering if you could just sort of address that question, maybe with that in mind, because I don't want you to have to just reiterate what you've said.
Right. No, I mean that question and what you mentioned are precisely part of what I was trying to get at when I mentioned that there's different ways in which the past of the 1960s and 70s is related to our present. And part of my qualms with people like Enzo Traverso or Asif Bayat, who basically have this broad-brushed narrative of moving from the good sort of past of 60s internationalism and leftism to the neoliberal present, which basically filled the void that was left by these ideologies. This whole transition movement that sometimes is articulated on the date of the collapse of the Soviet Union does not take into consideration precisely what the person who asked the question, in a way, I think had in mind, which is basically that there are certain legacies to these pasts, and there are certain, basically, they are attached to, I mean, as you mentioned, there are sort of like, there are affective structures, but they're also basically attached to particular political institutions and the kinds of politics at a small nitty-gritty level that these institutions sometimes held. So that, I mean, I cannot say what is to be done. I'm not in that position, but like my comment to the question would be, I mean, one could think a way in which, either there's basically, and that's happening in Lebanon, there are different generational dynamics that are happening inside these older organizations, or you can think about basically taking these concerns about class and exploitation and articulating them with other concerns, such as basically feminist concerns and environmental concerns, in new forms of organizations. I mean, these are the ways in which, because I mean, class exploitation is definitely not, going anywhere. So, and it's not disappearing. So the question is, I mean, how do you deal with this apprehension towards not questions, I think, of class exploitation, but towards basically histories of particular institutions that are still named, either sort of speaking in that name or involved in particular forms of political representation that one needs to sort of, rethink about. So I think the question of, I mean, trying to think, which is one of the most difficult questions today, I think, trying to think the question of the organization and you as a mediator between theory and practice is also something that is related to the question that was asked. Ranji, you're muted. I can't hear you.
Thank you. Okay, so let me also just tell you, given that we can't do the usual applause because of the sonic problems of Zoom, that many of the comments and all the questions start with, "That was a fantastic talk. This was a great talk." So let me just communicate that.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
We have a question from Yazan Dugan. Sorry, my pronunciation is terrible here. I was wondering if you could say more about the idea that the Arab uprisings are not concerned with the West. I agree with you that Arab revolutionaries, like all post-colonial and post-socialist revolutionaries today, do not take empire as their starting point, but rather regimes. However, I'm not sure that they do not take the West, however mythical a figure it is, as a model. Otherwise, how could we explain all those revolutionaries who sought asylum in Europe in the aftermath of uprisings?
Right. Thank you, Yazan. Yazan is a friend and a colleague. So thank you, Yazan, for this question. I mean, I can't say much. I am in agreement. I am in agreement with with you saying that the West has not disappeared, but what it's exactly what I'm trying to say is that the anti-West structure of feeling is not what fueled basically the revolutions, which is what I was getting at, and not to mention that the West itself has completely disappeared. Of course, one way in which you can counter my question is by saying, when you're talking about the West, what are you exactly talking about? Are you talking about a language, such as, are you talking about a geopolitical conjuncture? And what I mean precisely, in a way, by what I mean precisely, in that case, is that the notion, as you mentioned yourself, as the notion of emancipation itself, geared towards the regime, had more of an inwards gaze. Now, the West, so it's a very different structure of feeling, I think, than the one you find in nationalism in the 60s or in anti-colonial struggles or in some of the sort of Marxist ones. But if you think of the West not as precisely a geopolitical, foreign colonial force or force of empire, but if you think of the West, for example, as a moral language, let's say, that includes something like liberalism and rights, then it is not absent. So I am in agreement, which is why I said it's of course there, but it is not the ressentiment against the West or the sort of the desire to overcome the West, which fueled, which sort of, it's not an anti-moment in that sense. But the question is more complicated when you move to thinking, how are you thinking about the West? So, seeking asylum in Europe or thinking about liberal rights, if you want to put these under the rubric of the West, then the West is not disappearing.
Thank you. There's a question from Erdal Gökner. Bayaz's conceptualization goes back to his experiences in the Islamic Revolution in Iran. What kinds of emancipatory binds do you read in contexts of Islamism? Does a rethinking of the Arab revolutions involve a translational rereading of Islamism in these contexts? Islamism.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Thank you, Erda. I mean, I am suspicious to. I have a sort of a suspicion towards lumping different politics that take Islam as their idiom together under the banner of Islamism, because some are ethical movements, some are militant movements, some are, like in the Iranian case, state-sponsored, basically, politics. So we would have to have a longer conversation about this question. But my main answer is an apprehension to think that there is, one unified sort of Islamist policies that is then kind of, facing others, because, yeah, I would stop here. It's a tricky situation. It's not like socially constructionist argument that I'm making about Islamism. Rather, I think there's a multiplicity of forms of politics and a multiplicity of engagements that go under this banner, and sometimes it's hailed, when it's unified like this, sometimes it's hailed as an anti-imperialist force, sometimes it's basically hailed as a counter-enlightenment force, and sometimes it's hailed as basically a force, associated with sort of terrorist violence. So there's issues with that name that I think need to be unpacked.
Thank you, Fadi. I'm going to actually put a couple of questions together here. One from Yasemin Ipek, who asks you about the usefulness of the concept of neoliberalism. in understanding the history of Lebanon? And what about concepts such as crony capitalism and racial capitalism in understanding Lebanon? Are those useful to you, or are they also totalizing? And Sheena Jen asks, does Bourdieu's more internally differentiated analysis of class provide a corrective to the overarching left concept of class and its reifying effect on practice?
These are very, very big questions, both of them. I mean, again, I mean, to restate what I said, I have no qualms at all in using neoliberalism as an analytic to understand basically the workings of, in Lebanon, for instance, politics of accumulation by dispossession, to sort of, you know, cite David Harvey and how that happened, or practices of privatization and deregulation. So there is no escape from thinking about neoliberalism as an analytic to understand the transformations that took place in the sort of, let's say, Lebanese economy, alongside, if you want, the notion of sort of clientelistic networks, and as well the sort of very important role that sort of race plays through the kafala system in Lebanon. My qualms with neoliberalism is not as an analytic that is used sometimes to understand the workings of the economy. My qualms with it is when it becomes a totalizing language that seeks to basically foreclose from the domain of emancipatory politics subjects as being, in Bayat's terms, they were basically, and it's a very behavioralist idiom, they were conditioned, he says, by neoliberalism. So, there's two sets of literatures when you think about neoliberalism. One is the political economic one, and one is neoliberalism as related to the formations of political subjectivities and forms of normativity. And so my issue is when it's deployed to basically say, to like brush off people and say, oh, these are not, why aren't they revolutionary? They're not revolutionary because they're all neoliberal subjects. And that, I think, is a very different way than sort of thinking about how privatization works in Lebanon. So there's a political economic part, and there's a sort of, the sort of neoliberalism part that works with subjectivity. And my problem with that is with the totalizing move, less than with the analytic itself in particular ways. Sorry, Ranji. Yeah, oh, there was a question about Bourdieu and class. I mean, I personally was schooled in the Bourdieusian tradition, and do find that the way in which sort of Bourdieu's work attempted a synthesis between, Marx and Weber to sort of open up the notion of class through including cultural capital and symbolic capital in addition to economic capital, is definitely a move that sort of basically sheds a lot of light on, on the operations of power, let's say, outside of economic exploitation. And I stop there.
Thanks, Fadi. Yasmin Ipek also is asked. I'm just looking at the wrong thing here. Yusur Gareba is asking, do you think that there are new concepts that have been created in recent years apart from the old known ones? And I'm wondering also if there's a question, another question within that, which is about a new vocabulary as well? I mean, given that you're talking so much about translation, you know, I mean, to some extent one says, okay, you know, there's universality or universalities, or, you know, there are pluriverses, or there are, you know, we don't talk about humanity, we talk about humanities, et cetera, et cetera. You know, there are these kinds of ways in which there has been this reinvention of a vocabulary, right? That we're working with. But I think that the question here is that are there concepts that have actually demanded a new vocabulary? And do you see any of that circulating at the moment that is, I suppose, attentive to the current conditions, but also are terms that maybe will go through different kinds of multi-directional translation to reach us in a different way?
Right. I mean, yes, thank you. I mean, both of you. This is, I mean, you know, part of my part of what I'm interested in is sort of, you know, following Castoriadis, who says that the task of theory is to sort of provide new figures of the thinkable.
Right.
And I'm in the wake of the revolutions and the wake of the exhaustion, I think, of a certain form of, you know, post-colonial epistemology critique, especially in Middle East studies and anthropology, that is always trying to sort of, like, you know, react by sort of doing a critical move which sort of seeks to show how Arab thinkers, Arab artists, Arab intellectuals are reproducing Orientalist taxonomies, are reproducing colonial taxonomies. They are basically completely, you know, dupes of the kind of concepts they are using. They don't know that they are in this. I have, again, as I try to explain in the thought, I have many issues with this move. It's also its pretensions to being like an ersatz anti-imperialist move, because empire is then lodged in the conceptual architecture of the work, and then you need to dislodge it. This kind of sort of critical move does not allow us to capture the emergence and to capture the new figures of the thinkable. And I think it reached its political, I think, and its also theoretical exhaustion point after the Arab revolutions, whereby we need a new jargon. That question is great, because that's what I'm starting to do now. And in a way, I did it by sort of going back to the older generation of anti-colonial thinkers. I mean, and not only anti-colonial, because I've read some of the work that Arendt did, you know, and then how she's trying to rethink as well certain political events and work against political scientists and theorists in the question of the naming of the event, and to actually think that there are resources to, like, displacements stretching that produce newness, into the world. So I'm at that point. I'm thinking at the level of the kind of moves that are possible in order to sort of do that, moves from within traditions that we have. I haven't settled the question of whether, I mean, yes, there are, you know, one can think of, you know, sort of emergences from basically, you know, that are taking place, and there's part of me which is still thinking about the relationship of these emergences to these past traditions. Yeah. And whether, and in a way, if we can sort of like go back to reactivate certain kernels from them, or even reactivate certain moves in understanding the present, which is why that last part of the paper, which is the more tentative part, which is the kind of stuff I'm thinking about right now, and which is why I like the quote by Chakrabarty about basically repetition, displacement, and newness in the, you know, in the subaltern, the peasant, the wretched of the earth, as basically displacements of the proletariat in a non-industrial setting.
Thanks, Fadi. That's very interesting. I mean, it strikes me also that you know, in a sense, if we sort of think about the kind of revolutionary internationalisms of modernism, of various modernisms, right? Neologism was such a big part of the context in literary modernism, for example, and that might also be an interesting question
Right.
to think of. You know, where does neologism fit in to this language of transfiguration? So thank you for that. So there's we are at 11. Maybe I can just squeeze in one more question if you don't
Sure.
mind. There's one from Ruslan Yusupov. Thank you for the talk. I was wondering how Arab intellectuals were reading the Cultural Revolution in China. What specifically were they learning from the experience of China, and what they meant, and what that meant for understanding their own place and agenda in the universality they were imagining?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. There are many different readings of the influence of China. I mean, you know, because the Arab world is wide, and communist and Marxist sort of movements are different as well, the ideological ones. I can mention something about how, which is actually a very interesting, move. Part of the organizations and the militant intellectuals I worked with were very much influenced by the atmosphere of the Cultural Revolution, mediated through French and Italian Maoism, because of the question of language primarily, and because of the question of again what was then called third worldist publishing houses such as Maspero in Paris, and basically other places which really sort of were sort of like acted as a hub for them. So for these organizations, what was, at least, or individuals such as Sharara in the early 70s, what was interesting for them about what Maoism at the height of its global moment was a name for him, was a name for an attempt to, it provided a language from within the Marxist tradition to criticize the authority of the Marxist organization, through its critique of the distinction, through its critique of leadership, through its critique of the distinction between manual and intellectual labor. I mean, basically, similar moves to the ones that someone like Jacques Rancière would do, sort of like later on in some of the works. So that's the aspect of basically, it's less, thinking about, and it's also thinking about, I mean, I sort of developed that in the book a bit. It's also thinking about the revolutionary subject, not necessarily, I mean, as Shah says, as they are, not necessarily as a textbook image of a factory worker. So in a nutshell, thank you for this great question. I think, Maoism, one of the ways in which Maoism, what it enabled, so to speak, was some kind of post-colonial Marxism, I would say. A Marxism that, that opened up what is meant by class struggle, that opened up a space for a critique of the organization, and that opened up a space for the critique of vanguardism and Leninist vanguardism, and hence of basically fellow intellectual comrades. So it was on the theoretical level, it was a very fertile and theoretical space. Right. And it enabled them to do many things on these three levels: the question of organizations, intellectuals, and the relationship to the masses. But I can't, I can't claim to speak to all the different mediations of like Marxism in the Arab world.
Right. No, thank you, Fadi. I think that was a very interesting response, and I think that that there are just to sort of bring up another question. We don't really have time to answer it, but I think that it sort of fits into your response here to some extent. Is the way in which so many of us, so many people are doing work now that is really precisely about no mediation through Europe, right? The sort of South-South relations, for example, or not really South, but here sort of the China-Lebanon relations, how that functions in terms of translation, where it's mediated through other kinds of translations, whether translations are happening via French and Italian and English, for example, into those revolutionary circles. So it's really fascinating material, Fadi. I want to thank you a great deal for your presentation this morning. The book is wonderful. Buy it, everyone. Academics also, need people to buy these things. So do presses. But it's a really fantastic book, and thank you very much for your presentation this morning, Fadi.
Thank you, Ranji, so much for hosting me and for the generous engagement with the work. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you, Sarah and Jennifer, so much for making it happen. Thank you again.